Hello everyone, thank you for being with us today. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History. You can tell I'm watching the live stream at the same time because the sound is on. Normally I would have turned that down, I did not. We're in the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and if you have not already, please silence your cell phones. Join us next week for History's Lunch when Susanna Url from the University of Southern Mississippi will present the Territorial and Civil War Governors of Mississippi project. This program was originally scheduled for February, but then the winter storm shut down the capital city, so we've had to postpone it. Today, we're delighted to have Timothy Smith back with us to discuss the Siege of Vicksburg. The Carrollton native earned his BA and MA from the University of Mississippi and his PhD from Mississippi State University. Smith teaches history at the University of Tennessee at Martin. His most recent book is The Siege of Vicksburg, Climax of the Campaign to Open the Mississippi River, May 23rd through July 4, 1863, which follows his previous book, The Union Assaults at Vicksburg, Grant Attacks Pemberton, May 17 through 22nd, 1863. UT Martin?
Yes.
You give quizzes?
I do.
How many History is Lunch programs have you given?
4 or 5 or 6.
Would you accept that answer on one of your quizzes?
Maybe.
2010, your Heritage of Mississippi series book, Mississippi and the Civil War, The Home Front, was your first one. 2012, J.Z. George, Mississippi's Great Commoner, second one. Secession, Effects and Consequences at the Old Capitol Museum in 2014 on the 175th anniversary, and then you took a break after you folks moved from Mississippi and didn't come back until 2019 for The Real Horse Soldiers, Benjamin Grierson's epic 1863 Civil War raid through Mississippi. They've all been great. I know today will be as well. Help me welcome Tim Smith.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. And I probably would take that on a quiz, actually. In fact, give you a funny little story. I do book quizzes, and one of the books that I gave a quiz on one time was a book on the Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson, the Battle of New Orleans. And so I tell them I'm going to give you questions that are detailed enough that if you didn't read the book at all, you'll have no idea what I'm talking about, but they will be general enough that if you did read the book, that you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. You don't have to know the minutiae and dates and all that kind of stuff. So one kid, he got his quiz, and all he wrote on the whole quiz was, in 1814, we took a little trip down with Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi, wrote the whole song. I gave him 100. He got I accepted that answer. Well, it is good to be here. We're glad to be here. I say we. I've got my daughter, Mary Kate, with me here today. Proud to have her with me. Mama and the little one are at church camp, and so she tagged along with me today. So thank you for having us back. We always love to come back to Mississippi, love to come back to the archives. I can always do some research and so on. So good to be here. Today we're going to talk about Vicksburg. How many of you have been to Vicksburg? That's a dumb question, of course, in a setting like this. But it is a local topic, obviously, and it's very well known, very important, very central to our history around here and the history of the state. It is debated somewhat as to how important it was. Those of us around here, of course, probably would say, oh yes, it's the biggest and the best thing that happened during the Civil War. Those folks out in Pennsylvania, of course, in Gettysville or Gettysstown or whatever that place is in Pennsylvania, Gettysburg, would say something different, obviously. And I always tell people, I'm not going to convince you probably if you think Gettysburg's the biggest and the best and all that. There's nothing I could say probably that would convince you. But I happen to think that Vicksburg probably is the key stroke and the biggest stroke in the Civil War, and it's a bigger issue between the East and the West, obviously. I think the war was won and lost basically in the West. President Lincoln obviously thought Vicksburg was important. He deemed it the key. Vicksburg is the key. The war will never be won until that key is in our pocket. And so you start looking at the ramifications, and you all know this general history type stuff. We won't get into things like, for instance, the Anaconda Plan and the opening of the Mississippi River and how important that was. The Trans-Mississippi, how important the shutting off of all the goods from the Trans-Mississippi was. Terry Winchell talks about the three examples of white gold: cotton, sugar, and salt that came out of the Trans-Mississippi. So extremely important there. Removing a whole army from the Confederate ranks, of course, and all those weapons and so on. So there's tons of things that makes it very, very important. Looking at the campaign itself, though, and what I want to kind of do is start big and narrow down to the siege itself and kind of talk a little bit about some things in the book, some observations and so on. But I want to make a few comments just on the general campaign and kind of what I'm doing in this series and all. And I'm looking at this. I haven't made any firm conclusions yet, but some of you other historians in here could add into this a little bit. But I'm becoming convinced that Vicksburg is the biggest campaign, probably the most complex campaign in the Civil War. Now you say, well, there were a lot of armies a lot bigger. The Gettysburg campaign, a lot bigger armies and so on. And when McClellan moved down to the peninsula, over 100,000 men. That dwarfed anything that was going on in the Vicksburg campaign, sure. And there were larger campaigns, even, in larger history, in American history, that were larger geographically. Lewis and Clark went all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But they had 12, 15 men. It wasn't a big deal. So Albert Sidney Johnston goes to Utah. That campaign against the Mormons in 1857. That stretched out geographically in a huge area, but it's only several thousand men. So combining the idea of this huge geographic area that we're talking about with the huge numbers of people, I don't see that anywhere else, the combination of that. So I'm thinking Vicksburg is probably the largest campaign in terms of all of that put together, and in terms of tens of thousands, over 100,000 men, encompassing 7 states, operating over the course of 7 states, 9 months long. And of course it has all these very interesting attributes, such as pitched battles. We know about Champion Hill and Raymond and Port Gibson and all that. It also has naval operations, the Cairo and so on, cavalry raids, Van Dorn and Nathan Bedford Forrest and so on. Lots of these unique little aspects, like the Cairo, the first gunboat sunk by a mine and all that. So lots of interesting stuff in the Vicksburg campaign. It warrants a lot of study. Of course, there has been a lot of study in Civil War writing, dealing with the campaign, and this is where I kind of get into a little bit of what I'm doing in the volume here. And so I decided I wanted to do something on the Vicksburg campaign. I'd done a few things on Grierson's raid and Grant at Vicksburg and things like that. And so I wanted to do something on the assaults, and that's what kind of got all this started. And then the logical thing was to go next and do the siege. So that's, of course, where I am now. But looking at the Vicksburg campaign, this is when we'll kind of start general and kind of move down more specific a little bit to the siege itself. But if you look at the Vicksburg campaign itself, you can basically divide it into 2 basic operations. There are 2 basic goals that the Federals, Ulysses S. Grant, William T. Sherman, and all those are trying to achieve. One is to get to Vicksburg, or better way of saying that, basically to get to the high ground east of Vicksburg, on the same side of the river as Vicksburg. And just getting there encompasses months and months of work and many battles and fights and all that kind of stuff. Then the other one is to actually take Vicksburg. So they're two completely different operations. And if you write something on Vicksburg and say, okay, we're going to put a volume each. I didn't want to do just a one volume history. Our friend Mike Ballard, you all know Mike Ballard, that unfortunately passed away recently, wrote a good one-volume history of Vicksburg. Ed Bars, who unfortunately passed away recently, of course wrote the 3 volumes. So I didn't want to do 3 volumes, didn't want to do 1 volume. 2 volumes might be logical, one on the attempt just to get to Vicksburg, and then one on the attempt to actually take Vicksburg. But if you did that, one would be about 1,700 pages thick, and then one about 200 pages thick, because you're covering like 7 months in one and 6 weeks in the other. So I thought I don't want to do that. But to understand Vicksburg, understand that there are basically 2 major operations. And so, again, just to reiterate, to get to Vicksburg, you can't go through from the north because of the Delta, right? You can't go up the 300-foot bluffs to the west because of the 300-foot bluffs there, right? You can't really come in from the south because of the Big Black River and all of that. So you need to come in from the east. So to get to a point that you can actually start operations in terms of taking Vicksburg, you need to get within the shield of the Big Black River, east of Vicksburg, and that's what encompasses everything from the Mississippi Central Campaign through Chickasaw Bayou and all the bayou operations, Stills Bayou, Yazoo Pass, Lake Providence, all that kind of stuff, and then actually crossing the river Bruinsburg and all those fights in May of 1863, starting with Port Gibson and then Raymond and Jackson and Champion Hill and Big Black River. Finally, Grant reaches by May 17, May 18, the point, he attains that first goal of actually getting to a point that he can actually take Vicksburg. And then he starts the process. It's kind of a twofold process of actually taking Vicksburg, and that, of course, encompasses the 2 assaults on May the 19th and then May the 22nd. To begin with, both of those fail, of course, and then he goes into the siege operations for the next 6 weeks. Now, I'm not the only one that's ever come up with this, obviously. If you look in the historic record, particularly in Grant's memoirs, let me read you a little bit. That's why I have to put my glasses on. I can't see much of anything anymore. Let me read you what Grant says Sherman tells him. And you all know this story about when Grant and Sherman reach the Walnut Hills overlooking the battlefield of Chickasaw Bayou, where Sherman had been defeated back in December, and they're thinking, okay, we've got it made basically now. Grant says that Sherman told him that this is, quote, one of the greatest campaigns in history, and ought to make a report of it at once. Vicksburg was not yet captured, and there was no telling what might happen before it was taken. But whether captured or not, this was a complete and successful campaign. So Sherman and Grant looked at this as the ending of one campaign when they actually reach the point that they can take Vicksburg, and then they start the process of actually taking Vicksburg. So in terms of writing this book and how this fits into the whole concept of the Vicksburg campaign and so on, I looked at everything going on, and I thought, all right, you can break this down into 5 phases, basically, which can be broken down into essentially 5 volumes. And so the first one I wrote was the assaults book, May the 19th and 22nd, and I really didn't intend to do anything, a larger series or anything at that point, so essentially I started on volume 4. And wrote volume 4 first, which is a dumb idea if you're going to write a 5-volume series, but that's what I did. And so then I come out with volume 5 over here, which is dealing with the siege. And I can never get this right. If I would think ahead a little bit, it would help things probably. I well remember in graduate school, John Marslake, and you all know John Marslake, telling me, why don't you sit down and do some thinking before you start writing? And he said it in a nice way, and I thought, who needs to think? I'll just go start writing. But, it makes sense. Do some thinking before you start writing. I did this with the trilogy on the Tennessee River campaign when I wrote the book on Corinth, 1862. And then I decided, I ought to write one on Shiloh. So I went back in time and wrote one on Shiloh. And then I thought, well, heck, I ought to do this on Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. So I wrote so I had a good 3-volume history of the Tennessee River Campaign. I just wrote them backwards. And, now it doesn't really matter. You can get all 3 and read them in order and so on. But at any rate, I've started with Volume 4 and now Volume 5. And already written, actually, Volume 1. And it is at the publisher now. Under the process of peer review and so on. So 1, 4, and 5 are actually written, and 2 and 3, of course, are yet to be written. Actually, I've taken a little bit of Vicksburg break. I've kind of Vicksburged out a little bit for now, because these 3 volumes, and then before that was Garrison, and then before that was the Grant at Vicksburg book. So I've written 5 volumes on Vicksburg, not in the series or anything, but 5 straight volumes on Vicksburg, and just need a little bit of break. So I'm actually working on a biography right now. In fact, Kate and I were at Tulane yesterday. We're coming down here, of course. I thought, well, I've been trying to get in Tulane for I don't know how long, and they're scared of the shadow down there with this COVID thing and so on, and have just only recently opened back up. Really needed to get in down there, and so I was able to get in and do the research for this biography. So glad to be able to do that. So. Looking at some observations then, we'll kind of move on a little bit to some observations of the Vicksburg campaign, and then specifically dealing with the siege itself, some more general notes or observations. Couple of things that's just kind of struck me in terms of maybe we think Grant just crossed the river and marched and there's nothing to it, and he just beat Pemberton like a drum over and over and over and all that. And yes, that actually did happen. And we'll talk about Pemberton here in just a little bit. But looking at the whole thing in terms of the 7 states and 9 months and so on, it struck me one day, and I'm still working through this, of course, but you've got a large chessboard or canvas that you're painting, if you will, across 7 states, and for the first 6 months, 7 months, whatever, Pemberton is able to parry all of those threats that Grant issues, that Grant probes and pushes, Mississippi Central Campaign, Yazoo Pass, all of that kind of stuff. Pemberton is able to parry those and to stop those by moving troops with interior lines, and we're getting really into military terms and so on. But it struck me one day that basically Grant is not at his best when he's got a large canvas to play on. He's got a large chessboard to play on. Pemberton is at his best when he's got this large chessboard to play on because he can move troops in different directions, and they're not necessarily supporting each other and all of that. And the key thing, I think, though, is that it takes time to move all of these troops. Pemberton, for instance, just finished the Mississippi Central and Chickasaw Bayou volume. Pemberton is able to thwart that advance by Grant down the Mississippi Central Railroad. And then Sherman is moving down the river to Chickasaw Bayou, of course, and he's able to shift troops there to parry that threat as well. So as long as Pemberton has time and things aren't moving very fast, he can shift troops around and kind of move them where he needs to and win some victories and so on. But as we get closer to Vicksburg and later in the Vicksburg campaign, and as the chessboard shrinks, if you will, or if that canvas that you're painting on shrinks, Grant becomes better and Pemberton gets worse because things start happening a whole lot faster. You remember people talking about, when you get to the major leagues or the NFL or something, how much faster the game moves, in the NFL than it did in college or certainly in high school or something like that. And I think Pemberton found out, and especially with Garrison making raids all over, through the state and so on like that, I think he found out as things got smaller, things start moving a whole lot faster, and he was not quite able to keep up. And as a result, Grant could keep up with the smaller operations and the faster operations and so on. So that's one observation campaign-wide that I'm working on, and we'll bring out more, of course, as get into the other books and so on. The other thing I'm interested in and have been looking at a little bit is dealing with Jomini and Clausewitz. Anybody know who Jomini and Clausewitz were? These were military thinkers. Okay, I've got two hands back here, Jeff and Jim, and well, one more there. Jomini and Clausewitz were military thinkers from the Napoleonic era. One was French and one was, I believe, Prussian, right? Or is he Swiss? I can't remember. Anyway, over there, folks, foreigners. They're not one of us. So, at any rate, they wrote on the Napoleonic Wars and the art of war and how Napoleon did war and so on. And both of them were involved in the same wars, same battles and so on. But both of them came to completely different conclusions about why this worked and why it didn't work. And Jomini would say, this is how you need to do things. And Clausewitz would say, no, this is how you need to do things. So completely opposite kind of philosophies of war a little bit, and you can see those in the Pemberton and Grant philosophies. And in fact, I'll talk a little bit more about that probably a little bit later on, or go ahead and talk about it a little bit now. The first portion of the Vicksburg campaign, the Mississippi Central, Chickasaw Bayou, and all that, is purely Jominian. It's capture geographic points. It's have a good, safe line of supply to make sure you can get your supplies and your communications and all of that kind of stuff. Make sure you have good connecting interior lines that you can depend on supporting forces and all that kind of stuff. Clausewitz will say, forget all that. Just go to the enemy army and fight the enemy army and destroy them in an annihilating victory. And if the army falls, then your enemy government basically will fall. The first portion of the Vicksburg campaign, Chickasaw Bayou and Mississippi Central and all that, is pure Jominian. Grant is operating along this secure line of supply, he thinks, and whether it's the Mississippi Central or the railroad, and he'll try that to begin with, because that's how Napoleon apparently would have done it, according to Jomini. That's how Jomini says to do it. But more importantly than that, we're getting a little off track from the siege here, but more importantly than that, Grant's boss, Henry Halleck, is big into Jomini, and that's how Halleck says to do it. And so Grant is just newly elevated up to the Department of the Tennessee Command in October of 1862. So he's thinking, I better do it the way my boss says to do it. Y'all ever, kind of do that when your boss says, do this, do it this way? You say, no, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to do it my way, right? That's not going to win you many points there. So Grant says, I'm going to do it the way the boss says, the way the book says to do it, Jomini's book, and also Halleck's book. Halleck wrote the Elements of Military Art and Science. So he wrote the book. Let's do it the way that Halleck says to do it. And it turns out it doesn't work. And Grant throws the book away and says, all right, I'm going to do it the other way. And that's when we start getting into bio operations. There's not a lot in the books about, Napoleon cutting canals and cutting the levees on the river to flood the delta and moving through the Yazoo Pass and all that kind of stuff. Certainly not abandoning pretty much your standard supply line and crossing the river at Bruinsburg and then having only just a very limited supply situation and so on. All that goes completely against the book, and that's what Grant basically does. But say all that to say this, and I've wasted a lot of time there, but Clausewitz talks about that in Army operations, and gives examples of Napoleon and so on, he talks about there are times when an army, especially if it's a big army, can reach what he calls a cumulative or culminating point. A culminating point. We know what a culminating point is, kind of the end. Some of you are wishing, I wish you would get to the culminating point here, and we'll go get some more cookies there. But Clausewitz talks about the culminating point in terms of military operations, that when an army goes so far that it can't support itself and it kind of gets too stretched out and too top-heavy at the end. Think Napoleon's invasion of Russia. That was, eventually Napoleon reached a culminating point when he couldn't, sustain supply and all that kind of stuff as he moved forward. an example of this. Recently read a manuscript for a publisher on the Peninsula Campaign in the spring of 1862, and one of the arguments was that McClellan's army, when they moved forward up the peninsula through Williamsburg and Yorktown and all that kind of stuff and reached the Chickahominy River, that McClellan was basically at that culminating point that he really couldn't sustain reaching out too much farther. You know, you get too far out on the limb, and what's going to happen? The limb's gonna break, you know. So the author was making the argument there, and we see that here in the Vicksburg campaign when Grant is moving down the Mississippi Central, and even Sherman probably down the Mississippi River. It's almost like he gets too top heavy and gets too far out on that limb, and really Grant can't go much farther. In fact, we see obviously with Forrest and Van Dorn then tearing up the railroads in his rear that he can't move forward anymore. We also see this, and this is the main point I'm wanting to make here. I'm becoming convinced that Grant also reaches this culminating point on May the 17th or May 18th in terms of the operations against Vicksburg, in terms of getting to that point west of the Big Black River, that he can actually start the process of actually taking Vicksburg, because he's crossed at Bruinsburg and then, of course, opened up the supply line at Grand Gulf. But for 17 days there, all he's getting, really for 14 days, the last wagon train leaves Grand Gulf, I believe, on the 14th. He's getting basically wagon trains moving inland to his army, guarded by brigade or division-sized forces, and the last one, as I said, I believe is on the 14th. So it's not a traditional standard supply line where trains are bringing supplies up, you know, to support you and so on, or even steamboats and so on. And what I have found in dealing with these letters and diaries and so on is that when Grant fights the battle at Champion Hill, he has a lot of ammunition and so on, enough to fight that battle, and then the next battle at Big Black River the next day on the 17th. But what all of these soldiers are saying in their letters and diaries, especially on the 16th, 17th, and 18th, basically is that we're hungry. We haven't had anything to eat for several days. We're getting to the limit of our extent here, and we've got to get something to eat, or something, you know, is bound to happen. Now, there are instances, obviously, where you catch a goose and fry him or something, you know, individual things that if you come across something good to eat, that's going to help you. But feeding an army of 30-something thousand men is just not feasible. And so the vast majority, those that didn't run across the goose or something, are starting to get hungry. And of course, when you start not to eat for 2 or 3 days, what effect is that going to have on your physical ability in terms of fighting battles and all that? That's going to limit your physical ability. So I've always thought, and who am I to second guess Pemberton or somebody that, you know, was on site and all of that, you know, 150 years later. I try not to jump on anybody or second guess anybody unless it's Joe Johnston, and I'll talk about Joe Johnston here in a little bit. Second guess him all I want to, but I wonder if Pemberton had delayed instead of fought, if he might have delayed Grant reaching this point that he and Sherman are standing there looking over the Walnut Hills at the Yazoo River where his new line of supply is coming in. That's what's so critical about reaching that point. He now opens up this new line of supply on the Yazoo River, and they start getting in anything they want, all kind of ammunition and food and all that. So if Pemberton had not, say, come out of, you know, if he's defending Vicksburg, why he came out of his Vicksburg defenses, first of all, is you know, I wonder about. But secondly, why on earth he came outside of the shield of the Big Black River is really interesting to me. And of course, what he does, he gets defeated then at Champion Hill, east of the Big Black River, and then again at the Big Black River, trying to wait on that wayward division. So had Pemberton perhaps delayed and just held the Big Black River defenses at the railroad and then up farther north at Birdsong and some of these other ferries and so on, and just delayed instead of fought, would Grant have reached that culminating point that, okay, we don't have access to this new supply line at the Yazoo River, and we're running out of food? And, you know, what effect that would have had, I don't know. That's a if-then kind of thing. We don't really know. But the concept of the culminating point, I think, is very interesting. Now, let's turn to the siege itself. Some observations or notes on the siege itself. And I've just jotted down, I think it's like 5 different major things. And those of you that are really interested in Vicksburg and Civil War historians and so on, I'm not going to tell you anything new. But it's things that I thought about and struck me as I was going through the process of writing this book. One is dealing with Pemberton. I said we'd get back with Pemberton. And I say it a little more academically in the book than what I'm going to say here. But basically, one of my observations is that Pemberton is not as big an idiot as we've made him out to be. You know, everybody wants to jump on Pemberton and say what an idiot he is and all of that kind of stuff. And he does make his mistakes early. Earliest portions of the campaign, he again parries those threats by Grant and so on. And actually people will start to think, okay, well, this Pemberton's doing all right, you know, by March and April and so on. But then again, as the canvas gets smaller, the chessboard gets smaller, Pemberton starts, you know, his head starts spinning, basically. The whole thing about coming out of his defenses, but then coming out of the shield of the Big Black River, I'll never really understand that, if he is tasked with holding Vicksburg. Now, I know the thing about a mobile army, you know, and try to fight, but you're outnumbered and you leave nearly half your force back in Vicksburg. That's another issue. So there are some issues there that Pemberton certainly has. But, you know, there's some mitigating factors in terms of holding Vicksburg. Pemberton is being told, of course, by Jefferson Davis, hold Vicksburg. He's being told by Joseph E. Johnston, his department commander, get out of Vicksburg. It's a trap. And I've often joked that must be like having 2 mothers-in-law. You know, we won't go there, I don't guess. But Pemberton, you know, he's in a no-win situation. He has no, you're going to make somebody mad and you're going to disobey somebody. So which one do you obey? And obviously he obeys Jefferson Davis. In terms of the siege itself, to me, Pemberton conducts the siege pretty well. He does his best to conserve food. He does his best to conserve ammunition. And just looking at Pemberton and his efforts during the siege, never declares martial law and different things like that. I think Pemberton does pretty well. And for more detail, of course, it's all in the book. Now, I said we'd get to Joe Johnston. I said Pemberton is not as big an idiot as some have thought, and what we may have thought in the past. Well, Joe Johnston is a bigger idiot than we have thought in the past. We got any Joe Johnston fans in here? Okay. I don't know anybody really that just likes Joe Johnston. I was talking with Richard McMurray. If you know Civil War historians and so on, Richard McMurray is one of the great Civil War historians. And he's writing a 2-volume biography of Joseph E. Johnston, which is going to be really interesting. You may know him from 2 Great Rebel Armies and other things, Atlanta Campaign and so on. And so when I finished this, I saw him just recently, back in May, I guess, and I asked him, I said, I'm just interested in your take on Joseph E. Johnston. He's not finished with his biography and so on. And he said, well, basically, the more I get to know him, the more I hate him. And I said, I'm glad to hear you say that, because that's my sentiments exactly. The more I got to know this guy, specifically in terms of the Vicksburg campaign, just can't stand him. You know, there's some people that just come across as phony. Y'all ever known somebody that's just absolutely phony? We got any, well, I'm not going to go there either. But we'll keep this to Civil War generals, I guess. People like McClellan or Joseph E. Johnston or P.G.T. Beauregard, they just come across to me as just phony. Just, you know, say anything to cover their own rear ends and all of that, and always worried about their reputation and so on. Now, on the other hand, there are some that are just absolutely rock solid, that there's no phony anything about them, and you think of someone probably like a Lincoln or a Robert E. Lee or Albert Sidney Johnston, who wrote famously that the test of merit in my profession is victory. It's a hard rule, but I think it right. Folks like that don't seem phony at all. But to me, Joseph E. Johnston comes across as pretty phony. I'm convinced that he never intends to relieve Vicksburg. The whole idea for Johnston to gather troops west or east of Vicksburg, Jackson and elsewhere, is to relieve the siege of Vicksburg. When you get yourself in a siege, and this goes back to military theory and all that kind of stuff, when you get yourself in a siege and you can't get out of it, the one thing that you hope for is relief from an outside force. And that's why the textbooks, when you're talking about laying siege and so on, you have this line that actually holds in the besieged, and then you have a line in your rear, this is the besieging party, that covers your rear from any relief force, and their technical names, lines of circumvallation and contra, I don't remember exactly what all they are, but they're technical terms. So Johnston has this misnamed Army of Relief, because it doesn't relieve anything, that is supposed to resist or relieve Vicksburg, remove the siege, lift the siege. I think Johnston's more worried about his reputation than he is lifting any siege. In fact, I think Johnston probably has decided as early as May, mid-May, when he is sent to Jackson. He arrives on May the 14th, and he immediately sends that note, "I am too late." And from then on, I think Johnston says, "I don't want nothing to do with this. We're rearranging chairs on a ship that's sinking. Why are we doing this? Send me somewhere else." So I don't think Johnston wants anything to do with it, but he realizes that I'm sent here by the president, so I better at least act like I'm doing something for my what? Reputation. Because if I just say, I'm not playing today, I'll take my ball and go home, whatever, that's not going to look good for my reputation. So I better at least pretend and make like I'm doing something. What strikes me as critical is that Pemberton twice during the siege, this was like June the 15th, and then on maybe the 21st, 22nd, something like that, Pemberton will send Johnston word of how long he can hold out. And Pemberton, again, he's conducting this siege pretty well, and he's counting beans. He knows how much food he has. He knows how much they're issuing to each soldier, and he knows how many soldiers he has. And you can do a little math and figure out how many days of food we got left. And so he tells Johnston, I've got enough to hold out 20 days. I've got enough to hold out 15 days. And both times it basically lands on July the 4th, July the 5th, as the last that Pemberton can hope to hold out. Johnston realizes this, and do you know when he plans to make his movement? He writes Pemberton and says what? "I will attack on July 7th. So what does that mean? He's going to put just enough force, he's going to start moving just at the tail end of this, and let Pemberton, surrender and all that. But even during the surrender, what's going to happen? I will be shown as moving and trying to do something. We just ran out of time, and it's a little more complicated than that. Covered in the book, but I'm no fan of Joseph E. Johnston. Another observation is that the rear area, this Army of Relief area, was absolutely critical to the siege. Now, we know a little bit about it in terms of Grant goes on this drunken spree, and so on June the 6th. Didn't happen. A lot of that is fabricated, and it's been proven plainly now that these writers, Dana and Cadwallader and all those, kind of fabricate a lot of this. But it does illustrate how important this is to Grant. And Mike Ballard, I mentioned Mike Ballard earlier, actually used the word, I believe, paranoid in terms of Grant and the rear. He was absolutely paranoid that somehow Joseph E. Johnston is going to relieve the Confederate forces, lift the siege, and all that kind of stuff. And that's why, over the course of the siege, and I cover it in detail in the book, Grant will send commander after commander back to the rear while he's got his 3 corps focused on Vicksburg and digging approaches and digging trenches and all that kind of stuff. He's got commander after commander going back to the rear to try to cover the rear to make sure that nobody slips up on him and lifts this siege. Starting with just a colonel, Amory Johnson, with cavalry in late May. But then he starts sending others, Frank Blair, on this expedition up to Mechanicsburg and Satartia and that area. And then that is overtaken by Nathan Kimball. You may have heard of General Nathan Kimball that came from the east. Both Blair and Kimball kind of panic, and they they hear that the Confederates are coming, and they kind of scamper back into the defensive as Haynes Bluff and so on. And then more reinforcements, of course, come in, and Grant will send John Park and Cadwallader Washburn out to the rear. So he's constantly sending new officers back there to try to handle the situation until actually it becomes so important to him that who does he send back to the rear to cover the rear? Somebody that he can absolutely trust that won't get, stampeded and will panic and so on. William T. Sherman himself. In fact, Grant sets up. He gets word that the Confederates are going to advance within 24 to 48 hours. And if you look in the official records, all of his communications to all of his commanders, we have word that the Confederates are going to attack in 24 to 48 hours. And so Grant sets up this contingency plan, as I call it, that if the Confederates actually attack, Sherman will take part of the army from the trenches at Vicksburg, and with all these others that have been sent back to the rear, and he will go take command, and ultimately it includes about 33,000 troops. Nearly half of Grant's army is on the rear line covering against Joseph E. Johnston. Had he only known Johnston's not going to do anything anyway, he wouldn't have had to do that, but for some reason he thought Johnston was a good guy. But anyway, the point is the rear was critical, and so you don't get a whole lot of these you don't get a lot of detail at the park or in some histories and so on. But absolutely, the rear was critical. Now. Another observation, and I've kind of just written down that everyday life is the real story of the Siege of Vicksburg. And when you start looking at what these soldiers went through, y'all know how hot it gets in Mississippi during the summer, don't you? I mean, y'all are familiar with that, I would assume. You're sitting out there, no shade, no anything, and it's an extremely difficult situation. And in fact, when I wrote the book, I did this one a little bit different than other books. Most of them you just write chronologically, and you follow the sources chronologically and so on. But on this one, there were a lot of kind of humanistic, social history type things that I wanted to include that really didn't fit in to the chronology. And so a lot of the chapters, yes, they are based on chronology, but for instance, when I talk about naval operations, you can put that like in late May when the Cincinnati was sunk and so on, so you can fit these different kind of topics in the chronology. But I had several different kind of sections of the book that I wanted to deal with. For instance, the Confederate life in the Confederate trenches. What was life like in the Confederate trenches? What was life like in the Union trenches? What was life like behind the Confederate trenches? What was life like behind the Union trenches, in the camps and so on? And I just wrote a lot of stuff down here. In the rear, civilians, there's a lot of sections on civilians inside Vicksburg, both inside and actually on the outside that are affected by operations as well. Naval operations, skirmishing. What was it like to the constant skirmishing during the night? We all know about they getting together and trading knives and all that kind of stuff. What was it like during the nighttime? fraternization back and forth and so on. The operations over in Louisiana, the burial truce on the 25th. So there are a lot of different things that that kind of is more personal and kind of more social in nature, and not just military movements and so on, that really, I think, tell the real story of the Siege of Vicksburg. And then last but not least, and we're just about out of time here, and we'll take questions if anybody has any questions. The last observation I wrote down here is that Vicksburg did not surrender because it was starved out, or that it ran out of ammunition. Basically, the Confederates were dug out of Vicksburg. And I'll explain what I mean here in just a little bit. And there are other studies. There was a study that came out, Jim, what's the guy's name? Solonic, I believe, that did a book called Engineering Victory. And is about the Union engineers of Vicksburg. So it's not a comprehensive study of the siege at all, but it was strictly dealing with the engineering on the Union side at Vicksburg. Very good book if you're interested. But there's evidence of that as well, and I completely agree with his thesis that the Confederates were dug out. There are still rations available in Vicksburg. At the surrender. In fact, I did a little math. Math is not my strong suit, but in fact, there are a couple of different sources for this. Pemberton said how much food he had left at the time of the surrender. He says we have 4 or 5 days worth. Grant later on, when the Union forces came in, they accounted for how much bacon and meat and so on that they had. And talking about, everyday life of a soldier, eating mule meat. Anybody ever eaten any mule? I haven't either. I'm not sure I want to go there. But Grant said how much food was left, and so I kind of did some math, and just in general terms, but extrapolated out for 30,000 troops, we'll just say, sick and wounded and on the line and all that. If they were issuing, say, the 4 ounces per day of bacon to those many soldiers and so on, I did the math, and it comes out to about 4 or 5 days. So what Pemberton said he had left is what Grant basically said that they found inside Vicksburg. Now, if they got 4 or 5 days of food left, then there's food there. They were not basically starved out. Now, when the surrender actually comes at the end of, yes, they're eating mule meat and all that kind of stuff, but there is food left in reserve to be held in case there is a breakout attempt. The whole idea of Johnston coming and lifting the siege is to be in cooperation with a Confederate breakout attempt at the same place. And so if we try a breakout attempt, we're going to have food to carry with us, not only for the day we break out, but for a day or two as we march, to safety. So that's what those 4 or 5 days of food was being held for. So, there's plenty of food. They could have lasted 4 or 5 more days, but they surrender at the end of the tangible, at the exhaustion of the tangible amount of food, not the reserve amount of food. And so they could have lasted 4 or 5 more days, but, what good would it do? You're just going to have to surrender in 4 or 5 more days because you're not going to have any food to break out or, to last at all. It's kind of like, when the guys landed on the moon in the Apollo project, they went down so far in the lunar module that they got to the point what they call Dead Man's Curve. Y'all ever heard about Dead Man's Curve and so on? It was so far down that you couldn't abort anymore. That you had to make a decision. If you went below this certain point, then there was no aborting and going back to the command module and all that. You were going on down whether you controlled your descent and landed or whether you didn't control and you crashed. Once you reach that point, there's no turning back. So once Pemberton reaches this point that we're out of our ready amount of food, then there's no use in trying a breakout attempt. If we're not going to try a breakout attempt, there's no use in just continuing with that food supply. But at any rate, the point is that there is food left inside Vicksburg. There's also ammunition left inside Vicksburg. Grant talks about how much that he got. the actual surrender comes basically because the Union lines had dug their approaches, and we could get into the technical aspects of siege warfare and so on and do in the book, but the surrender comes as the Union forces dig their way basically up to just within a few feet of the Confederate works. And of course, the difference that makes at the time is that either you can start digging underneath the Confederate works and blow up the enemy with a mine and gunpowder, or you can just simply launch an assault over the top and be there within seconds. During the assaults on May the 19th and 22nd, the Union forces had to assault over hundreds of yards of ground, taking fire the whole time, and a lot of them were driven back because of that. But if you get to the point that I'm within a mere 6 feet or so, just over the parapet from the enemy, then you can just push right over and the assault will work. In fact, Grant had an assault planned for July the 6th. And Pemberton probably realizes this. He knows they're about to be assaulted again, and this time there's no way that the Confederates can withstand this assault. And so Pemberton realizes we're out of food, we're worried about ammunition, so on. But the major reason is that they're about to assault us, and that we can't withstand this, and our fortifications and so on are just being beaten down, being torn down and so on. So that's when actually the surrender comes. So those are just a few little observations on the Vicksburg siege. Many more, of course, in the book, but just a few observations that I thought were fascinating and found fascinating in terms of studying the Vicksburg siege. So any questions? Do we have any questions out there that we need to talk about? Chris has a microphone.
If anyone has questions, raise your hand. We'll bring the mic to you.
No questions. All right, we got one right here.
I'll make up a question, and it's not a scholarly question.
Okay.
If they were dug out, were they unaware of knowing that the Union had gotten that close?
Oh, no, they absolutely knew it. They were watching every day as they get a little closer and a little closer and a little closer, and wondering, what are we going to do when they get up basically next to us? And they can actually hear them digging mines underground. You can listen, and those that know, you've always heard that you can put your ear to a rail and hear the train coming and all that. Those that know what they're doing can listen on the ground and can tell where they're digging. And if you dig your own hole and get down underground, some of the engineers talked about, we can hear them. We think they're a little bit above us and a few feet to the left and so on. So they absolutely knew they were approaching close. They could see it every day, and they knew they were digging under them, and they knew it's just a matter of time that we can't defend against this. Any other questions? Got one right there.
Yes, you brought out something I had never thought about before. Where was the nearest Confederate support?
The nearest Confederate support would have been Joseph E. Johnston, and we all know that he's not going to support anything. So if you put all your eggs in Johnston's basket, you're in trouble, and that's not going to provide any relief. Now, there are some Confederates on the other side of the river. In fact, they make an attack there at Milliken's Bend, where the African-American, the USCT colored troops are in action and win a lot of accolades because they're fighting at Milliken's Bend and so on. That's in early June, but that's across the river. So the nearest force on the same side of the river as Vicksburg is Joseph E. Johnston. And incidentally, I found it interesting, Joseph E. Johnston, in laying blame for everything, he would tell Jefferson Davis and others, oh, it's not my fault, and it's all Kirby Smith's fault across the river. Kirby Smith's not doing enough in Arkansas and Louisiana to aid Vicksburg. And finally, toward the end of the siege, he says, if anything can be done, it's got to be done by Kirby Smith, who has minute numbers of troops on the other side of the Mississippi River, while he's on the same side of the Mississippi River with 30,000 troops, but yet he can't do anything. Did I mention I didn't like Joseph E. Johnston? Okay. Johnston gets no closer. He never crosses the Big Black River. He keeps his headquarters in Canton part of the time, Jackson part of the time. Some of his forces, Breckinridge's division, is in Jackson. Others are spread out northward all the way at times to Yazoo City. And when they do begin to move just to show a force, they will move through the Livingston area, Brownsville, kind of toward the Big Black River, but they'll never actually cross the Big Black River. So there's no confrontation ever, really, just some very minor skirmishing. Jeff, we got a question?
Yes. What do you think of Grant's decision to parole the Vicksburg garrison after the siege ended?
I think Grant lied to us in his memoirs, for one thing. These memoirs, you always have to be very careful in terms of memoirs written much later on, because much like Joseph E. Johnson, who writes his own memoirs and tells us what he wants us to know, Grant basically says that I didn't want to send them north on to prison camps and all that. I wanted to parole them and all that kind of stuff. Well, you look at the original letters and correspondence and so on, Grant wanted to send them north to prison camps. And he and Frederick Steele were the only ones that wanted to do that. And everybody else was telling Grant, you're crazy. It's going to tie up all our shipping and boats and all that. It's going to cost an inordinate amount of money to move them up there. And then we're just going to have to parole them and send them back anyway. And so just let them go home, let them parole them, let them go to their homes, and when they do that, maybe they won't come back. And we were just talking about some 36 Mississippi folks that went home and never came back to the war, which is exactly what Grant hoped they would do. So all in all, I think it was the logical decision. And Grant, actually in some of the correspondence, not in his memoirs, which he tells a different story in his memoirs, but in some of the correspondence, he actually says, I was against this, but everybody else thought we should do it, so I yielded to popular opinion, kind of thing. But I think it was the right thing there. So,
Tim, we have a question from the live stream.
Okay.
Tony Morgan asks, did elements of 31st Mississippi or any of Loring's division reach Vicksburg after the Battle of Champion Hill?
31st Mississippi. That's Loring's division. No, they not to my knowledge. After the surrender, is that what it said? Or after Champion Hill?
After Battle of Champion Hill.
No, that division, Loring's division, that's Colonel MDL Stevens, 31st Mississippi. They will march southward along the Big Black River, go to Crystal Springs, and then up to Jackson, where Loring's division will become part of Joseph E. Johnston's army, and will sit and twiddle their thumbs. I found an account that it may have been in the 31st Mississippi, actually, that they formed a Masonic lodge in the regiment. So that tells you they're not doing much of anything in terms of preparing to go get Grant, are they? So, we got one more question?
After the battle, how did Joe Johnson attempt to justify his failure to provide timely relief, whether he did it in his memoir or otherwise, and how did he deal with the question of was he or was he not given specific orders to provide timely relief, which he might have ignored?
Right. Well, you have to remember the context of his hatred for Jefferson Davis and Jefferson Davis' hatred for him. And the two will go at it for the rest of their lives on into the 1870s, 1880s in their memoirs, back and forth and so on. So in large part, that's how Johnson will get his word out and so on. But even contemporaneously at the time, Johnson will write Davis and say, this is not my fault. Don't try to lay this blame on me. You didn't send me enough troops. You didn't send me enough transportation. Blah 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 blah. And he'll blame Davis. He'll blame, as I said, Kirby Smith. He'll blame Pemberton. He'll blame everybody. In fact, one of the communications I thought was pretty interesting. He's pretty snarky kind of guy, kind of, sarcasm and all that. And he writes Davis and says, I didn't know it's now the custom in military theory to lay blame on the commander for a subordinate not obeying that commander's orders. So if the subordinate doesn't obey the commander's orders, then the commander who ordered the original thing that the subordinate didn't obey gets blamed for the defeat. And what he's saying is, I ordered Pemberton to get out of Vicksburg to begin with. And so now you're blaming me for losing Vicksburg? I didn't know that was the new way to do things. So he's a little bit snarky. I
I
don't
wanted
like
to
that.
ask you about the Confederate Navy. Were they ever a factor, or if, just kind of a hypothetical, if there was a Confederate Navy, would that affected the general war? I know that didn't affect Vicksburg, did it?
Well, no, there's not much of a Navy. They start putting ironclad coating on a lot of these steamships and so on, but before most of them are ever finished, they get captured, or the area where they're being worked on or something is captured. It's like the Eastport in the Tennessee River campaign. You know, they're working on the Eastport up in Hardin County, Tennessee, but before it's done, it gets captured by the Federal Navy. And we know about the Arkansas at Vicksburg and so on, but it's not really ready and completed and got the good engines and all that kind of stuff. It could have made a difference if it was a Navy comparable to the Union Navy, obviously. It would have taken huge amounts and large numbers of boats and so on to make any difference, but there was never any real chance that was going to happen. Just not a chance.
I know there are more questions. Unfortunately, we have come to the top of the hour. However, I bet Tim Smith will be delighted to answer your question while he's over here signing copies of his book that we have for sale. Thank you all for being here. Next week's program is, again, Susanna Url talking about the joint project, the territorial and Civil War governors of Mississippi papers that have been transcribed and are being put online. It's a really interesting project that is available, from your phone in your pocket, your computer, whatever. That really is an interesting insight into that era. Thank you all for being here today. Again, we have copies of the book for sale. Help me thank Tim Smith for this fabulous program.
Thank you very much.